The fire in the great hall had not yet burned low when Kellan Ashworth lifted his hand and broke a bond that had held for 4 years. He did not lower his voice. He did not choose a private room. He stood on the raised stone floor where every pack member could see his face, and he said the words that ended his marriage to Sabrina Voss in front of 400 witnesses. The hall went silent the way a forest goes silent before a storm. Sabrina stood 2 steps below him, in the dress she had chosen that morning because it was her favorite, not knowing it would become the dress she wore the night her husband cast her aside. She did not move. She did not speak. Her hands, folded in front of her, did not shake. Kellan had rehearsed this moment for weeks. In his mind, she wept. In his mind, she reached for him, and he pulled away, and the pack saw him as strong enough to choose duty over sentiment. That was the story he had told himself. That was the story he needed to be true. Instead, Sabrina reached up and unclasped the moonstone pendant resting against her collarbone. It was the first gift he had ever given her, back when he still looked at her like she mattered more than any alliance. She held it out, and when he did not take it fast enough, she simply placed it on the stone at his feet. Elira Thane stood at his side already, dressed in ceremonial white, her expression carefully arranged into something like sympathy. She was the reason for tonight. Her bloodline was old and powerful, and joining it to the Ashworth line would make Kellan's pack the strongest in the Northern Territories. That was what the elders had told him. That was what he had chosen to believe was worth more than a marriage. "You will always have a place among us," Kellan said to Sabrina, because it was the kind of thing a king was supposed to say, even when it meant nothing. Sabrina looked at him then, and for one moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Not tears, not anger, something closer to recognition, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time in years, and did not like what the clarity showed her. "I already have a place," she said quietly. "It simply isn't here anymore." She turned before he could answer, and she walked the length of the hall alone, past pack members who had once bowed to her, past elders who had once praised her wisdom, past the doors that had been opened for her as Luna 1,000 times before. Nobody stopped her. Nobody followed her. Kellan watched her go and told himself that the tears would come once she was alone. He told himself that grief needed privacy to be real, and that hers was simply delayed. He believed, in that moment, that he still had power over her sadness. The feast continued because pack law demanded it continue. Wine was poured. Toasts were made to the new alliance, to the promise of stronger heirs, to a future built on Thane blood joined with Ashworth strength. Elira sat beside him, radiant and composed, already speaking to elders as if she had always belonged in that chair. Kellan smiled when he was expected to smile. He laughed when laughter was required, but some part of him kept drifting toward the empty space beside the dais where Sabrina had once stood, and toward the doors she had walked through without looking back. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself that a king could not afford to measure his choices by feeling, only by the strength they bought his pack. He told himself many things that night, and every one of them was a small lie built to protect a larger one. Wren, Sabrina's longtime handmaid, did not attend the feast. She left through the servants' corridor before the wine was even poured, her jaw tight, her eyes dry in a way that unsettled anyone who noticed. She had served Sabrina since they were both children running through the same gardens, long before either of them understood what pack politics would eventually cost. She knew Sabrina better than anyone in that hall, better than the husband who had just discarded her in public. She knew that Sabrina Voss did not cry in front of an audience. She never had, not once, not even as a girl who had lost both her parents within the same terrible season. Sabrina's grief did not spill outward for others to witness and judge. It went inward, and it went quiet, and it became something far more dangerous than tears ever could. Wren found her in the Luna's private chambers an hour later, already pulling gowns from their hooks and folding them with sharp, precise movements. There was no sobbing. There was no shaking. Sabrina moved like someone completing a task she had planned for a long time, not one improvised out of heartbreak. "You knew," Wren said, It was not a question. I suspected, Sabrina answered, not looking up from the trunk she was filling. A wife learns to read the silences in a marriage long before her husband learns to speak them out loud. How long? Long enough. Wren crossed the room and gently took the folded gown from Sabrina's hands, setting it aside so she could look her friend directly in the face. What she found there was not devastation. It was something colder, something that had clearly been building far longer than one humiliating ceremony could explain. "He expects you to break," Wren said. "I know. He will come looking for the version of you that breaks." Sabrina finally met her eyes, and for the first time that night, something like a smile touched her mouth. It held no warmth in it. It was the kind of smile a person wears when they have already decided exactly what they intend to do next, and the decision has stopped hurting them and started steadying them instead. "Then he will be disappointed," she said. "That version of me left the hall the moment he opened his mouth." Outside the chamber windows, the pack lands stretched dark and quiet under a rising moon, unaware that the woman preparing to disappear from them by morning was not fleeing in grief. She was leaving with purpose, carrying with her a history that Kellan Ashworth had never bothered to learn, a bloodline far older than the one he had just chosen to marry into, and a plan that had been forming, patient and unseen, for longer than anyone in that hall could have guessed. By the time the moon reached its highest point, the Luna's chambers stood empty, stripped of every trace of the woman who had lived there for 4 years. Not a single item had been left behind by accident. Everything had been chosen, folded, and carried away with the same calm precision Sabrina brought to everything she did when she had stopped feeling and started deciding. Kellan did not know it yet, but the woman he expected to find broken in the morning had already stopped being his to break. She had simply been waiting until the hall was empty enough for no one to see her leave. The night swallowed the sound of carriage wheels long before the sun rose over Ashworth territory, and when the first light finally touched the empty windows of the Luna's chambers, there was nothing left inside them but silence. 3 days passed before Kellan let himself walk toward those chambers again. He told himself it was concern that carried him down that corridor, not guilt, though the two had started to feel identical in his chest. He told himself he simply wanted to check on her, to see if the tears had finally come, to offer whatever comfort a discarded husband could still offer a discarded wife. He knocked once, out of habit more than respect, and when no answer came, he pushed the door open himself. The room was empty, not disturbed, not ransacked in the frantic way grief sometimes moves through a space. Empty in a deliberate, finished way, as though every trace of Sabrina Voss had been carefully erased rather than hurried away. The bed was stripped bare. The wardrobe stood open and hollow. Even the small collection of books she used to keep on the windowsill, worn from years of reading, had vanished without a single page left behind. Kellan stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in his stomach that he refused to name. Wren was waiting for him in the hallway when he finally turned around, arms crossed, expression unreadable in a way that felt deliberate. "Where is she?" he asked, though some part of him already understood the question would not be answered easily. "Gone," Wren said simply. "Gone where?" Wren tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one might study a puzzle that had finally revealed its missing piece. "She told me you would come looking," she said. "She told me to tell you the tears you were waiting for already happened, 2 years ago. You were simply too occupied with everything else to notice them." Kellan felt the words land somewhere he did not expect. 2 years? "She stopped hoping for you long before tonight, Alpha King. Tonight only confirmed what she already knew. You did not break her heart in that hall. You only finished breaking it." He wanted to argue. He wanted to insist that surely she had cried. Surely somewhere behind a locked door she had wept the way any wife should weep over a marriage ending. But the empty room behind him told a different story, and so did the cold, steady look in Wren's eyes, a look with no pity left in it for him at all. "Where did she go?" he asked again, quieter this time. Wren's smile was thin and unreadable. Somewhere you never once bothered to ask about while she was still your wife, she said. Perhaps it is time you learned who you actually married. She left him standing alone in that empty room, the moonstone pendant still resting untouched on the dais where Sabrina had left it 3 nights before, and for the first time since he had spoken those cruel words in front of the entire hall, Kellan Ashworth felt something other than certainty about the choice he had made. Sabrina Voss had not left Ashworth territory as a broken woman fleeing into the night. She had left as someone returning to a place she had not seen since she was a girl of 12, carried away after her parents died, and the Voss lands fell into the careful, quiet control of neighboring packs who called it protection and meant something closer to control. The carriage carrying her and Wren crossed 3 borders before dawn, moving through forest roads that Sabrina remembered only in fragments, half-formed images of running feet, and her mother's voice calling her home for supper. By the time the sun rose fully over the hills, the road had turned to something rougher, less traveled, winding toward land that most maps still labeled abandoned. It was not abandoned. It had simply been waiting. The old Voss stronghold stood at the center of the territory, half swallowed by ivy and years of neglect, but its bones remained strong. Stone walls that had withstood 2 centuries of weather still stood straight. The great hall, though dust-covered and dim, still held the shape of the power it once contained. Sabrina stepped through its doors for the first time in over a decade and felt something settle inside her chest that had been unsettled since the night her parents died. "This is where you grew up," Wren said softly, standing just behind her. "This is where I was meant to grow up," Sabrina corrected. "I only got the first 12 years of it." Word of her return spread through the scattered Voss bloodline faster than either of them expected. Within a week, old families who had once served her parents began arriving at the stronghold gates, some out of loyalty long buried, others out of curiosity, wanting to see if the last living heir of the Voss line was truly standing among them again. Elder Corwin Vale was the first to formally kneel before her, a stooped, silver-haired wolf who had served as her father's most trusted advisor before the pack scattered. His eyes were wet when he looked up at her, though his voice remained steady. "We thought the Voss line ended with your parents," he said. "We thought the Ashworth pack had absorbed what remained of us for good." "It nearly did," Sabrina answered. "But blood does not disappear simply because it goes quiet for a while." Corwin studied her for a long moment, taking in the calm set of her shoulders, the steadiness in her voice that had not existed in the frightened 12-year-old girl he remembered. "You have changed," he said. "I have learned," Sabrina replied. "There is a difference." Over the following weeks, the stronghold began to breathe again. Sabrina worked from sunrise until well past dark, walking every hall, reviewing every ledger the previous stewards had left behind, meeting with families who remembered her parents, and families who had never known them at all. She did not ask for blind loyalty. She asked for patience, and she earned trust the same way her mother once had, through consistency rather than performance. Wren watched her friend transform in those early weeks from someone who had survived a public humiliation into someone actively building something meant to outlast it. There were no tears in the stronghold. There was only work, steady and relentless, the kind that left no room for old grief to take root. "You are not simply rebuilding your family's land," Wren observed one evening, watching Sabrina pore over an old map of the territory's borders by candlelight. "No," Sabrina agreed. "I am rebuilding myself. The land only happens to come with it." News of her return eventually reached beyond Voss borders, carried by traders and travelers who had no reason to keep quiet about a story so unusual. A discarded Luna, once married to the Alpha King himself, resurfacing not as a grieving exile, but as the confirmed heir to an old and respected bloodline, rebuilding a stronghold that had stood silent for over a decade. It reached the ears of Alpha Rowan Hale of the Fenmark territory before it reached Kellan's, which was precisely the order Sabrina had hoped for. Rowan Hale had been a name in old family stories long before he became a name in current pack politics, an alpha whose territory bordered both Voss and Ashworth land, and whose family had clashed with Kellan's for 2 generations over disputed hunting grounds and old grievances that predated either man's birth. Where Kellan ruled through inherited strength and political marriage, Rowan had built his position through direct action, earning loyalty from wolves who respected results over bloodline alone. He arrived at the Voss stronghold gates 3 weeks after Sabrina's return, unannounced, with only a small guard and no ceremonial procession. "I did not expect an invitation," he said when Sabrina met him in the courtyard, "so I decided not to wait for one." "That is either very confident or very foolish," Sabrina replied. "Perhaps both," Rowan said, and something in his easy smile suggested he found the possibility more amusing than concerning. They spoke for hours that first visit, not about romance, not about alliance in any formal sense yet, but about borders, resources, and the shared frustration of dealing with an Ashworth pack that had grown accustomed to assuming its neighbors would simply accommodate whatever it wanted. Rowan had lost grazing land to Ashworth expansion 3 years prior, a dispute that had never been properly resolved. Sabrina had lost, arguably, far more. "You are not what the stories describe," Rowan said near the end of that first visit, studying her with open curiosity. "What do the stories describe? A woman destroyed by rejection, hiding somewhere licking wounds no one is meant to see." Sabrina's answering smile held no warmth in it, the same cold, steady expression Wren had first seen the night of the ceremony. "Then the stories are already out of date," she said. "I would suggest updating them." By the time Rowan Hale left the stronghold that evening, no formal alliance had been signed, no promises exchanged beyond careful, measured words about mutual respect and shared interest. But something had shifted between the 2 territories, a quiet acknowledgement that the balance of power along the northern borders was no longer as settled as Kellan Ashworth assumed it to be. Sabrina stood at the stronghold gates long after Rowan's guard had disappeared down the forest road, watching the fading light settle over land that had once belonged to her parents and now, slowly, deliberately, belonged to her again. She thought of Kellan only briefly that evening, and when she did, it was not with grief. It was with a distant kind of curiosity, wondering how long it would take before the reports of her return reached him, and wondering, with something almost like anticipation, what he would do once they did. The moonstone pendant she had left on the dais at his feet had meant something once. It had been proof that a girl who lost everything at 12 could still be given something worth keeping. Leaving it behind had been the final act of a woman choosing not to carry his gifts into whatever came next. What came next, she intended to build entirely on her own terms. Training began the following month, not out of paranoia, but out of the practical understanding that a territory reclaiming its place in northern politics needed more than old loyalty and careful diplomacy to protect itself. Sabrina appointed Corwin Vale as her chief advisor, drawing on decades of experience her own father had once relied upon, and began assembling a personal guard from among the returning Voss families, young wolves eager to prove themselves loyal to a bloodline many had assumed extinct. Wren took charge of training the guard's discipline and coordination, drawing on skills she had quietly developed over years of protecting Sabrina without anyone in the Ashworth pack ever fully appreciating how capable she truly was. Within 2 months, what had been an empty, half-forgotten stronghold had become something functional again, guarded, organized, and increasingly aware of its own growing relevance. Sabrina did not send word to Kellan. She did not need to. She understood, with the patient certainty of someone who had spent years learning to read her former husband's silences, that reports would reach him eventually, carried by traders, by wandering wolves, by the same networks of gossip that had once carried news of her humiliation through his hall. She was, in fact, counting on it. The report reached Kellan Ashworth on an ordinary afternoon, delivered by a scout who had no idea the words he carried would unsettle an Alpha King more than any battlefield loss ever had. "The Voss stronghold has been reclaimed," the scout said, kneeling in the war room where Kellan had been reviewing grain reports with 2 of his elders, "by the former Luna, Alpha King, Sabrina Voss. The room went quiet in a way that made the scout regret speaking at all. Kellan set down the ledger in his hands with careful, deliberate slowness, the kind of control he had learned to use whenever his instincts wanted to do something far less measured. Say that again. Sabrina Voss, my king, she has returned to her family's territory. The elders there have accepted her as heir. She is rebuilding the stronghold, gathering a guard, and there are reports that Alpha Rowan Hale of Fenmark has visited her personally. Every word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through a calm Kellan had spent months constructing around himself. Sabrina Voss, not the grieving woman he had imagined hiding somewhere licking old wounds. A rebuilder, a rival heir reclaiming forgotten power along his own northern border, and doing it in open alliance with a man whose family had opposed his own for 2 generations. "Leave us," Kellan said quietly, and the elders and the scout obeyed without argument. Alone in the war room, he allowed himself, briefly, to feel the full weight of what he had just learned. He had assumed, in the arrogant way powerful men often assume things about people they have stopped bothering to understand, that discarding Sabrina meant removing her from relevance entirely. He had assumed her identity began and ended with the title she held beside him. He had never once, in 4 years of marriage, asked about the bloodline she came from before that marriage. Never once wondered what history she carried that predated him. It was, he realized with a discomfort he did not enjoy, an oversight born entirely of his own carelessness. Illyra Thane found him still standing in the war room an hour later, staring at an old territorial map pinned to the wall, one finger resting against the boundary line that separated Ashworth land from what had once been dismissed as abandoned Voss territory. "You look troubled," she observed, though her tone carried more curiosity than concern. "The Voss stronghold has been reclaimed," Kellan said, not looking away from the map. Illyra's expression shifted, something careful and calculating passing behind her eyes before she settled back into practiced composure. "By whom?" "By my former wife." The silence that followed told Kellan everything he needed to know about how Illyra intended to receive this news. She did not offer comfort. She did not offer reassurance. She simply studied him, assessing, the way she assessed every situation that might affect the position she had worked to secure. "That is unfortunate," she said finally, though the word carried none of the weight it should have. "Though I fail to see why it concerns us. She is no longer your wife. Her ambitions, whatever they are, no longer belong to this pack." Kellan did not answer immediately. Something about Illyra's easy dismissal of the situation grated against him in a way he could not fully explain, even to himself. Perhaps it was the reminder of how quickly she moved past complications that did not directly serve her own interests. Perhaps it was simply that her indifference stood in such stark contrast to the version of loyalty Sabrina had once shown him, before he had spent it carelessly. "Her ambitions border our territory," he said eventually. "That makes them our concern, whether we wish it or not." Reports continued arriving over the following weeks, each one adding detail to a picture Kellan found increasingly difficult to ignore. Sabrina had appointed advisors from the old Voss families. She had begun training a personal guard. She had met with Rowan Hale not once but multiple times, each visit lasting longer than diplomatic necessity alone could explain. Kellan told himself his growing unease was purely strategic. A rebuilding Voss territory allied with Fenmark represented a genuine shift in the northern balance of power, one that any responsible Alpha King would monitor closely. He told himself this so often that he nearly believed it, ignoring the quieter, less convenient truth sitting beneath the strategic concern, the truth he was not yet ready to examine directly. He sent an emissary to the Voss stronghold under the careful pretense of discussing border cooperation, a diplomatic gesture that any neighboring territory might reasonably expect from an established Alpha King. The emissary, a steady, unremarkable wolf named Edmund Price, returned 3 days later with a report that told Kellan far more than its careful diplomatic language intended. "She received me courteously, Alpha King," Edmund said, "but she made her position quite clear. The Voss territory intends to operate independently, going forward. She expressed no interest in renewing any formal ties to Ashworth land beyond standard border agreements available to any neighboring pack. And Rowan Hale? He was present during my visit, Alpha King. Their alliance appears substantial. They have begun coordinating patrol routes along their shared border, and there is talk among the Voss elders of a formal treaty being drafted between the two territories. Kellan absorbed this information with the same careful stillness he had learned to project since childhood, the mask of composure that had served him well through every political maneuver of his rule. But alone that night, pacing the length of his private chambers long after the rest of the stronghold had gone quiet, he found himself unable to settle the restless energy building beneath that composure. He kept returning, against his own better judgment, to the memory of Sabrina's face the night he had rejected her, the flicker of something behind her eyes that had not been grief at all, but recognition, as though she had already understood something about him that he himself had not yet grasped. He kept returning to Wren's words in that empty chamber, the accusation that the tears he had waited for had already happened years earlier, unnoticed, because he had simply stopped paying attention. He had told himself a story about Sabrina Voss for 4 years, a story that cast her as steady, dutiful, content within the boundaries of a marriage built more on alliance than affection. He had never once questioned whether that steadiness came at a cost he refused to see, whether her contentment was real or simply the practiced performance of a woman who had learned early in life that survival often required concealing what one truly felt. He began riding toward the northern border more frequently after that, always under the guise of legitimate concerns, border disputes, trade route inquiries, security assessments that any responsible Alpha King might reasonably conduct. Each time, he told himself the visits were strategic necessity. Each time, some quieter part of him understood the visits were something else entirely, though he refused to name it directly even in the privacy of his own thoughts. He caught glimpses of her during these visits, always from a distance, always through the careful arrangement of legitimate business that kept him from ever needing to explain his true motivations. He watched her direct her growing guard through training exercises with the same calm authority she had once brought to managing Ashworth's own affairs, authority he realized, with growing discomfort, he had simply taken for granted rather than genuinely appreciated. He watched her laugh once, during a visit disguised as border security discussions, sharing some quiet joke with Rowan Hale as they reviewed patrol schedules together, and something twisted uncomfortably in his chest at the easy familiarity between them, a familiarity that had once existed between himself and Sabrina before he had chosen to trade it away for political advantage. She never once looked in his direction during these visits, though he knew, with growing certainty, that she was aware of his presence each time. Her guards would have reported it. Her advisors would have noted the pattern of an Alpha King suddenly discovering frequent business along a border he had ignored for years prior. She simply chose not to acknowledge him, continuing her work with the same steady focus regardless of whether he stood watching from a careful distance or not. That deliberate indifference unsettled him far more than any confrontation could have. Back in Ashworth territory, Elira grew increasingly impatient with what she perceived as unnecessary distraction. She raised the subject carefully at first, framing her concerns as practical rather than personal, questioning why an Alpha King needed to personally oversee border matters that could easily be delegated to trusted advisors. "You spend more time discussing Voss territory than you spend discussing our own pack's affairs," she observed one evening, her tone carefully measured, despite the edge beneath it. "Border security along a newly reclaimed neighboring territory requires careful attention," Kellan replied, the same justification he had offered himself countless times already. "Or perhaps," Elira said, setting down the correspondence she had been reviewing to study him directly, "you simply cannot accept that she built something worthwhile without you." The words landed harder than Kellan expected, precisely because some quiet, uncomfortable part of him suspected they held more truth than he wanted to acknowledge. He did not answer immediately, and his silence told Elira everything she needed to know about how close to the truth her observation had landed. Meanwhile, within the walls of the Voss stronghold, Sabrina continued her work with the same patient determination that had carried her through every difficult season of her life since childhood. She was aware of Kellan's increasingly frequent visits under increasingly thin diplomatic pretenses. She discussed the pattern openly with Wren and Corwin Vale during their evening strategy sessions, treating his behavior not as a personal matter requiring emotional response, but as useful information about an alpha king whose composure was beginning to crack under pressure he had brought entirely upon himself. "He watches you," Wren observed one evening after Kellan's most recent visit had concluded. "Every time he comes, he watches you longer than any border discussion requires." "I know," Sabrina said simply, continuing to review the ledger in front of her without looking up. "Does it not concern you?" "Why would it concern me? A man who spent 4 years failing to see me clearly has suddenly discovered he is capable of looking. That says considerably more about his own regret than it does about any danger to us." Rowan Hale, present for that particular conversation, allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile. "You are remarkably unbothered by an alpha king's growing obsession with your affairs." "I am unbothered," Sabrina replied, "because his obsession changes nothing about what I intend to build here. Whether he watches from a distance or stays away entirely makes no difference to the work in front of us." But even as she said the words, something quiet and unspoken passed between her and Rowan, an understanding neither of them voiced directly, that Kellan Ashworth's increasingly visible unraveling represented an opportunity neither of them intended to waste. A king distracted by regret was a king whose attention drifted from matters that required his full focus. A king whose composure was cracking in front of his own advisors was a king whose pack would eventually begin noticing the cracks themselves. Sabrina had learned patience during the years she spent as Luna of a marriage built on convenience rather than genuine partnership. She understood, better than most, that the most effective revenge required no dramatic confrontation at all. It simply required steady, patient work, building something strong enough that the man who had once dismissed her would eventually be forced to watch it surpass everything he had chosen over her. That work continued, unhurried and deliberate, while 3 territories away, an alpha king found himself increasingly unable to ignore the growing distance between the life he had chosen and the life he had discarded without ever truly understanding its worth. The Thane alliance had promised strength. What it delivered, 6 months into Alira's position as Luna, was a slow, creeping discontent that spread through Ashworth territory like frost across still water, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. It began with small things. Alira dismissed a longtime steward over a minor scheduling error that Sabrina would have corrected with a quiet word rather than a public reprimand. She restructured the harvest distribution in a way that favored families connected to her own Thane bloodline, a decision that technically followed pack law but violated the unspoken sense of fairness Sabrina had maintained for years. She attended council meetings with visible impatience, treating the concerns of elder wolves as obstacles to be managed rather than wisdom to be considered. None of these actions alone represented a crisis. Together, accumulating week after week, they created a growing sense among the pack that something essential had been lost, though few wolves dared say so directly in front of their king. Kellan noticed the shift gradually, the same way one notices a wound only after the initial numbness fades and the actual pain begins. He heard it first in the quality of silence during council meetings, a silence that felt different from the respectful attention Sabrina had once commanded, closer to resignation than genuine deference. He heard it in the careful, measured way pack members phrased their concerns to him directly, choosing words designed to avoid offending a Luna whose temper had become unpredictable. An elder named Percival Ash, one of the pack's oldest and most respected advisors, finally addressed the matter directly during a private meeting Kellan had called to discuss the upcoming winter provisions. "The pack is unsettled, Alpha King," Percival said, his weathered face carrying the particular gravity of a wolf who had served 3 generations of Ashworth rulers and had earned the right to speak plainly. Wolves who once approached the Luna's chambers freely now hesitate before doing so. The harvest distribution has caused resentment among families who feel unfairly overlooked. Morale among the younger guard has grown noticeably thin. These are administrative matters, Kellan said, though even as he spoke the words, he understood how hollow they sounded. They can be corrected. They could be corrected, Percival agreed carefully, if the pack believed correction was actually intended. Forgive my bluntness, Alpha King, but many among us remember a different kind of leadership from your previous Luna, one that did not require correction because it rarely erred in the first place. Kellan did not respond immediately, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken but unable to genuinely dispute its accuracy. Percival's observation echoed something he had been noticing himself for weeks, a comparison he had tried to avoid making directly but found increasingly impossible to escape. "Are you suggesting the pack regrets the change in leadership?" Kellan asked finally. Percival chose his words with obvious care. "I am suggesting, Alpha King, that leadership is measured not by the strength of the alliance it represents, but by the wisdom it demonstrates in daily governance. The pack does not concern itself with bloodlines and political advantage. It concerns itself with whether its concerns are heard and its needs are met fairly. That concern has grown, not diminished, since the change you speak of." The conversation left Kellan with a discomfort that followed him through the following weeks, growing sharper each time he witnessed further evidence of the pattern Percival had described. He began attending council meetings more carefully, noticing details he had previously allowed to slide past his attention. He noticed how younger guard members, once eager to volunteer for challenging assignments under Sabrina's leadership, now approached their duties with visible reluctance under Elira's increasingly erratic direction. He noticed how the Harvest Festival, once a celebration Sabrina organized with genuine warmth toward every family regardless of standing, had become under Elira's planning a rigid, hierarchical affair that favored connected families and left others feeling deliberately excluded. He began, for the first time since the night of the rejection ceremony, to genuinely question whether the alliance he had sacrificed his marriage to secure was actually worth what it had cost him. Elira sensed his growing distance before he fully acknowledged it himself. She confronted him directly one evening, her composed exterior finally cracking under the pressure of watching her position grow increasingly precarious. "You compare me to her," she said, no longer bothering to disguise the accusation as anything else. "Every decision I make, you measure against some idealized memory of a woman you discarded without a second thought." "I do not discard memories as easily as you assume," Kellan replied, and even as he said it, he recognized the truth in his own words, with an unfamiliar kind of discomfort. "You married me for the alliance my bloodline represents," Elira said, her voice sharpening with genuine frustration. "Do not pretend now that you expected genuine partnership from this arrangement. I gave you exactly what our marriage was built to provide: strength, political advantage, the promise of stronger heirs. I never promised to replicate whatever domestic contentment you enjoyed with a woman you yourself chose to discard." Her words carried an uncomfortable accuracy that Kellan found difficult to argue against. He had built his marriage to Elira on the same calculated foundation he had once believed marriage should require: strength measured in bloodlines and alliances rather than genuine connection. He had assumed, foolishly he now realized, that discarding one arrangement built on convenience and replacing it with another would produce a different result simply because the second arrangement carried greater political weight. He had not accounted for the possibility that Sabrina's steady, quiet competence had never actually been convenience at all, but genuine skill he had simply taken for granted until its absence became impossible to ignore. The unraveling accelerated further when reports arrived that the formal treaty between the Voss and Fenmark territories had been finalized, a comprehensive alliance covering shared border defense, trade cooperation, and mutual military support in the event either territory faced external threat. The treaty represented, in practical terms, the emergence of a genuinely formidable power along Ashworth's northern border, one built through careful diplomacy and mutual respect rather than the kind of forced political marriage Kellan had relied upon throughout his own rule. He received the news during a council meeting, and the reaction among his own elders told him everything he needed to know about how the pack now viewed the comparison between the two approaches to leadership. Several elders exchanged knowing glances. Percival Ashe said nothing directly, though his expression carried a weight of quiet vindication that stung more than any spoken criticism could have. Kellan requested a private audience with Sabrina that same week, framing the request through official diplomatic channels as a necessary discussion regarding the implications of the new Voss-Fenmark Treaty for regional stability. The request was accurate in its substance, even if it disguised motivations Kellan himself had not yet fully acknowledged. Sabrina's response arrived 3 days later, delivered by Corwin Vale with the same measured formality that characterized all official Voss correspondence. She would receive the Alpha King, the message stated, though the audience would be conducted according to Voss territory protocol, on Voss territory grounds, at a time of her own choosing rather than his. The conditions themselves represented a message Kellan understood clearly, even before he arrived at the stronghold gates 2 weeks later. He was no longer dealing with a former wife whose schedule accommodated his convenience. He was dealing with the sovereign leader of an increasingly powerful neighboring territory, one who would meet him on entirely equal terms or not meet him at all. He arrived at the appointed hour, alone except for a minimal guard escort required by basic diplomatic protocol, and found the stronghold transformed from the half-abandoned ruin his scouts had first described 8 months earlier. Training grounds bustled with organized activity. Storehouses stood full and well-maintained. The great hall, once dust-covered and dim, now carried the warm, lived-in quality of a home genuinely cared for, rather than merely occupied. Sabrina received him in that great hall, seated not on any elevated dais designed to project authority, but at a simple table positioned to place them at equal height, a deliberate choice that Kellan recognized immediately as a quiet rejection of the theatrical power display he had employed the night he rejected her. "Alpha King," she said, her tone perfectly courteous and utterly without warmth. "You requested this audience regarding the Fenmark Treaty, I believe." "I did," Kellan confirmed, settling into the chair across from her with an awareness of how strange it felt to sit across from Sabrina Voss as an equal negotiating party rather than a husband addressing a wife. They discussed the treaty's implications for over an hour, covering trade route adjustments, shared border patrol coordination, and the practical realities of maintaining peaceful relations between 3 territories whose historical grievances predated any of their current leaders. Sabrina conducted herself throughout with the same calm, thorough competence Kellan remembered from their years of marriage, though he found himself noticing, with growing discomfort, how much sharper and more confident that competence had become without his presence diminishing it. Near the conclusion of their formal discussion, during a natural pause as Corwin Vale gathered documents requiring review, Kellan found himself speaking before he had fully decided to say anything at all. "You have built something remarkable here," he said. Sabrina looked up from the documents in front of her, studying him with an expression that gave away nothing of what she might be feeling. "I have built what should have existed for the past decade, had circumstances allowed it sooner." "I did not know," Kellan said, "how much of yourself you set aside during our marriage. I assumed the woman I married was simply content within the boundaries I provided." "You assumed a great many things," Sabrina replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. "Assumption, I have learned, is a luxury only afforded to those who never bother asking the actual question." The words carried no dramatic edge, no visible anger, simply a plain statement of fact that landed with far greater weight than any accusation could have managed. Kellan found himself without an adequate response, uncomfortably aware that everything she said was true, and that no apology he might offer could adequately address 4 years of careless assumption. Corwin Vale returned with the final documents, and the formal audience concluded shortly afterward, with Kellan departing the stronghold no closer to resolving the discomfort that had been building within him for months, and considerably more aware of exactly how much he had lost the night he chose political convenience over the wife whose genuine worth he had never bothered to fully see. He rode back toward Ashworth territory in silence, his guard escort maintaining careful distance, sensing correctly that their king required no conversation during the journey home. Behind him, the Voss stronghold continued its steady, purposeful activity, entirely unaffected by whatever quiet reckoning had begun taking shape within the man who had once discarded its leader without a second thought. Winter arrived early that year, settling over the northern territories with a sharpness that made old wolves speak of harsh seasons ahead. Within Ashworth territory, the cold seemed to seep into more than just the weather. Kellan watched his pack's morale continue its slow decline through the season, watched Elira's frustration curdle into something closer to bitterness as she recognized, with growing clarity, that her position among the wolves she was meant to lead had never fully solidified and showed no signs of doing so. The final unraveling came not through any single dramatic event, but through an accumulation of small failures that finally forced the pack's discontent into open conversation. A trade dispute with a southern territory, mishandled through Elira's impatience with diplomatic nuance, resulted in the loss of grain contracts that would have secured the pack through the harsh winter months. Younger guard members, increasingly disillusioned under leadership that prioritized bloodline politics over genuine competence, began requesting transfers to border patrols far from the stronghold, effectively removing themselves from daily proximity to a Luna they no longer respected. Percival Ashe finally requested a full council session, an unusual step that signaled the severity of what he intended to address. Kellan granted the request, sensing already the direction the conversation would take. "Alpha King," Percival began, standing before the assembled elders with the weight of decades of service behind his words. "This pack has endured 6 months of declining stability under current leadership. I speak not from personal grievance, but from genuine concern for the wolves who depend on this council for their protection and prosperity. The alliance secured through your current marriage has provided political weight, but it has cost us something considerably more valuable: the confidence and morale that steady, competent leadership once provided." Elira, present for the council session despite the discomfort evident in her rigid posture, responded with sharp defensiveness. "You speak as though comparing me to a woman who no longer holds any position within this pack serves some legitimate purpose. I am your Luna. My leadership deserves respect, regardless of whatever nostalgia the pack continues to harbor for its predecessor." "Respect is earned through demonstrated wisdom," Percival replied, his tone respectful but unyielding, "not claimed through bloodline alone. This council does not doubt the strength your family's alliance provides. We doubt, increasingly, whether that strength has been matched by the governance our daily well-being requires." Quote, the council session continued for hours, elder after elder, voicing concerns that had clearly been building in private conversation long before finding this formal outlet. Kellan listened throughout, saying little, recognizing with growing discomfort that the pattern being described matched precisely what he had witnessed himself in recent months, but had lacked the courage to fully acknowledge until now. When the session finally concluded, Elira remained in the council chamber after the elders had departed, her composure finally breaking entirely in the privacy that remained. "You said nothing," she said accusingly. "Your own elders openly criticized my leadership, and you offered no defense." "What defense would you have me offer?" Kellan replied. "When the criticism holds accuracy, I cannot honestly dispute." The conversation that followed lasted well into the night, covering ground both had avoided directly addressing for months. Elira acknowledged, eventually, what Kellan had already begun to suspect, that she had entered their marriage viewing it purely as political advancement, with no genuine intention of building the kind of partnership that sustainable leadership required. Kellan acknowledged in turn that he had made the same calculation, valuing political alliance over the qualities that actually determined whether a pack thrived or merely survived under its leadership. "We built this marriage on the same foundation," Elira said finally, her earlier bitterness settling into something closer to weary honesty. "Neither of us expected genuine partnership. Perhaps it is time we both acknowledged that foundation cannot support what this pack actually requires." The formal dissolution of Kellan and Elira's marriage proceeded quietly over the following weeks, conducted through careful diplomatic negotiation rather than any public ceremony, a deliberate contrast to the humiliating spectacle Kellan had once orchestrated for Sabrina. Elira returned to Thane territory with her family's alliance intact, but her ambitions toward Ashworth leadership permanently concluded. The pack, sensing the shift immediately, began showing visible signs of relief within days of the announcement. Kellan spent the following month in quiet reflection, working alongside Percival Ashe and other trusted elders to address the practical damage Elira's leadership had caused, while also confronting, with increasing honesty, the deeper failures in judgment that had led him to that damage in the first place. He understood now, with clarity that had taken far too long to develop, that his rejection of Sabrina had never actually been about securing genuine strength for his pack. It had been about his own arrogant assumption that strength could be manufactured through calculated alliance rather than earned through the kind of steady, competent partnership Sabrina had provided without ever receiving proper acknowledgement for it. He did not immediately seek her out. He understood, finally, that any approach made too quickly would simply repeat the same pattern of assumption that had damaged their marriage in the first place, expecting her to simply accept whatever he offered without genuinely earning the right to ask for anything at all. Instead, he spent months rebuilding Ashworth's own governance, working directly with pack members whose concerns Elira had dismissed, restoring the harvest distribution system to the fairness Sabrina had once maintained, addressing border security concerns with the same thoroughness Sabrina had brought to every aspect of pack management during her tenure as Luna. He did this work not as performance intended to eventually impress her, but because he had genuinely come to understand, through painful reflection, what competent leadership actually required. When he finally requested an audience with Sabrina, nearly a year after the night he had rejected her before the entire pack, he did so through the same formal Voss protocol she had established for their previous meeting, requesting her time rather than assuming access to it. She received him again in the great hall, seated at the same simple table that placed them at equal standing, though something in her expression suggested she recognized this visit carried different weight than the previous diplomatic discussion. "You did not come to discuss border treaties this time," she observed. "No," Kellan confirmed. He spoke then, without the careful diplomatic language he had relied upon during their previous meeting, offering instead the honest reflection he had spent months developing. He acknowledged the arrogance of assuming her steadiness during their marriage reflected contentment rather than quiet endurance. He acknowledged the cruelty of choosing public humiliation as the venue for ending their marriage, a choice made to protect his own political image rather than any genuine consideration for what she deserved. He acknowledged, finally, that he had spent 4 years failing to see the actual person standing beside him, too focused on the political advantage her position provided to ever genuinely appreciate the woman fulfilling it. Sabrina listened throughout without interruption, her expression giving away little of what she might be feeling as he spoke. When he finally finished, the silence that followed stretched long enough that Kellan began to wonder whether any response would come at all. "You have said a great deal," she said finally, "that I have waited a long time to hear." "I understand if it comes too late to matter," Kellan said. "Perhaps it does," Sabrina replied, her tone carrying neither cruelty nor false comfort, simply the plain honesty that had characterized every interaction between them since the night of her rejection. "I stopped waiting for this conversation the same night you delivered your rejection in front of 400 witnesses. Grief has a shelf life, Alpha King. Mine expired long before you found the courage to offer whatever this is." The words carried the same cold clarity Wren had first delivered in that empty chamber nearly a year earlier, and Kellan understood, finally and completely, that no apology could simply restore what his carelessness had destroyed. Sabrina was not cruel in her response. She was not even angry, the particular quality of anger that might have suggested she still carried enough investment in him to feel wounded by his failures. She spoke instead with the calm finality of someone who had genuinely moved beyond needing anything further from him at all. "I built something here that no longer requires your presence to feel complete," she continued. The territory thrives. The alliance with Fenmark provides security beyond what any marriage to Ashworth ever offered me. I have found, in the space you left behind, a version of myself considerably stronger than the woman you once knew. I can see that, Kellan said quietly. Then, perhaps, Sabrina said, rising from the table to signal the conclusion of their conversation, you can also see why I have nothing further to offer you beyond the diplomatic courtesy our territories require of each other. Kellan departed the stronghold that evening understanding, with complete and painful clarity, exactly what he had lost the night he chose to humiliate her before an entire hall of witnesses. He had expected tears that night, expected the satisfaction of watching her break beneath a rejection he believed himself entitled to deliver. Instead, he had found only an empty bed and a cold smile that told him everything he needed to know about a woman who had already stopped needing him long before he ever noticed she was gone. He returned to Ashworth territory to continue the slow work of rebuilding what Alira's leadership had damaged, carrying with him the permanent knowledge that some losses, once fully realized, could never be fully reclaimed. Sabrina Voss continued building her own legacy along the northern border, her territory growing stronger with each passing season, her alliance with Rowan Hale deepening into something that resembled genuine partnership rather than mere political convenience. The moonstone pendant remained where she had left it, still resting on the dais in the Ashworth Great Hall, untouched by anyone who understood its significance. A quiet monument to the night an Alpha King discovered that the coldest rejection is never the one delivered before a crowd. It is the one delivered afterward, in the silence of an empty room, by someone who has already, completely, and permanently stopped needing you to notice.